The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, despite preparing for a meeting with Donald Trump in Alaska on August 15, is not preparing for a real ceasefire, let alone stopping the war. These are the conclusions reached by Ukrainian and European intelligence, which emphasize that in recent days, on the contrary, there has been an intensification of preparations by Russian troops for new offensives and new assaults. And the situation at the front indicates that Putin has no intention of stopping. At the same time, it became known today that the meeting between Trump and Putin is still shrouded in secrecy. And right now, work is underway to clarify the topics that will be discussed. This was stated at the White House, and they hinted that there are still many issues that need to be discussed, including the issue of ending Russia's war against Ukraine. But this isn't the only issue, and even the White House isn't sure how to discuss it. That's why positions are still being coordinated, including on the issues that Trump and Putin will discuss. Well, and the Financial Times writes that dictator Putin has a certain plan for these negotiations, and it doesn't concern the territorial issue at all. In Russia's war against Ukraine, no, Putin is trying to resolve slightly different issues in his dialogue with Trump, and they actually have nothing to do with the war. In this episode, we'll examine intelligence signals and the context of preparations for the Trump-Putin meeting. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 12th. Let's go through everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. President Volodymyr Zelensky said, citing intelligence, that Putin is not preparing for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Next is a quote from Zelensky. Putin is only focused on presenting a meeting with America as his personal victory and continuing to act as he did before, putting pressure on Ukraine just like before. There is not a single sign that the Russians have received signals to prepare for a post-war situation. Zelensky added that the Russians are moving their troops right now in this way to launch new offensive operations. Quote, if someone is preparing for peace, he doesn't do that. He, meaning Putin. We continue to inform our partners about the real situation on the battlefield in diplomacy and in Russian planning for further actions. Let me remind you that recently, United States President Donald Trump stated that during his meeting with Putin, he will try to return some of the valuable territory occupied by Russia during the war back to Ukraine. He also noted that the upcoming meeting with the Kremlin dictator will be a trial one and said that no final decisions will be made at it. Moreover, Trump stated for the first time that he is not going to sign any peace agreement with Putin. He says that it's not his business, but he wants to help resolve this war. But he says that the peace agreement should be signed by Putin and Zelensky themselves. He says that Putin will have to meet with Zelensky because he is not going to sign anything. Meanwhile, Bloomberg writes that Ukraine and European countries will have a call with the American president ahead of the meeting between Putin and Trump. It is noted that this conversation will be devoted to further options for putting pressure on Russia, as well as preparing possible peace talks and related issues of territorial claims and security. Well, that's the context. Zelensky's statement that Putin is not going to cease fire and rather wants to present this meeting with Trump as a personal victory. In this context, Cable News Network reports today that work is still ongoing to clarify the topics that will be discussed by Trump and Putin. American officials are rushing to agree on the details before United States President Donald Trump and Kremlin dictator Putin meet on Friday, August 15 in Alaska. Because what about logistics? Such geopolitical questions still remain unresolved. The publication says efforts are ongoing to clarify what Trump and Putin will discuss. The head of the White House hopes that the conversation with Putin may bring significant progress toward ending the war in Ukraine. It is noted that 7 months ago, when Donald Trump became the President of the United States for the second time, he took office with the hope that he would be able to use his relationship with the Kremlin dictator. However, Trump became disappointed in the Russian leader since he is playing a double game, and only now has the United States President begun to use personal diplomacy. As NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated today, next Friday will be important because it will be dedicated to testing Putin to see how serious he is about ending this terrible war. The Cable News Network report also says that Trump has privately told his advisors that any attempt to end the war is worth the effort, even if it does not succeed. According to the publication, the United States president insisted that his team organize the meeting as soon as possible this week. Even though organizing such meetings, especially with an opponent like Russia, can take weeks or even months. It was long unclear if Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky would be invited to this meeting. When Trump announced that he would meet with Putin, he did not mention him. The publication notes that while the White House hasn't ruled out Zelensky's attendance at the Alaska summit, officials say their main focus is arranging the Trump-Putin meeting, face-to-face. As the United States ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, stated, if he believes that the best option is to invite Zelensky, then he will do so. The meeting will take place on Friday. There is time to make this decision. On August 11, President Zelensky warned that concessions to Moscow would not stop Russia's military actions in Ukraine, and he called for increased global pressure on Russia. He also sees no signs that Moscow will end its military aggression. And in the cable news network report, it is stated that Ukrainian officials have made it clear that Zelensky is ready to go to Alaska if Trump invites him. At the same time, they admit that everything will depend on how the meeting between Trump and Putin goes. As the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, stated, we have shown that he is ready to be anywhere to promote the peace agenda. Therefore, if necessary, President Zelensky will, of course, be present at the meetings. We have been very open about this, but let's see how it goes. It is noted that during the meeting between the Kremlin dictator's deputy and United States Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Moscow last week, it was clear that a central element of Putin's plan would be significant territorial concessions from Ukraine. Meanwhile, Trump's aides believe it is necessary to secure the support of European countries for the United States president's peace efforts. Therefore, most of the weekend was spent trying to explain Trump's goals. In turn, European politicians are expressing concern about how Putin might approach this meeting in Alaska. They insist that if Russia demands territorial concessions from Ukraine, then the aggressor country must give up occupying other parts of Ukraine. Cable news network also reports that Senator Lindsey Graham stated that he also wants Ukraine to participate in the peace negotiations. And here is his quote. I hope that Zelensky will be able to take part in this process. I'll leave that to the White House. I'm confident the president will attend the meeting with Putin from a position of strength, that he will look after the interests of Europe and Ukraine to put an honorable end to this war. At the same time, the Financial Times writes that dictator Putin has a certain plan, and it's not exactly the same as what many media outlets are talking about right now. Vladimir Putin is likely trying to make a deal on the Ukraine war with the United States president, which would then be imposed on Kyiv as a fait accompli. British journalist and columnist Gideon Rachman writes about this in an article for the Financial Times. As Rachman notes, the Russian leader is seeking an agreement that would leave Ukraine unprotected, unattractive for investment, and on the path to implosion. And in Moscow, they hope that if Ukraine rejects the proposed offer, Washington will simply stop any support for Ukraine. The author also claims these scenarios are likely. However, Ukraine and its allies in Europe believe that there is a chance to achieve a more positive outcome. And now I'll quote the Financial Times. From their point of view, a good outcome would be a ceasefire agreement with the threat of secondary sanctions against Russia. If Putin resumes the war, the discussion of the territorial issue will only take place after that. War is unpredictable. But the most convincing analyses I've seen indicate that Ukraine is slowly losing. The manpower problem on the front line is growing more acute. This means that a complete failure of negotiations and the continuation of the war are likely to be better for Russia than for Ukraine. Next, Rachman notes that Kyiv takes a principled position that not a single territory can be given to the enemy. However, in the current situation, he believes it is unrealistic. The author writes that an important nuance lies between actual and legal concessions of territory. Thus, legal recognition of Russia's control over the seized territories is unacceptable for Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States. But actual recognition of harsh realities in the context of a broader peace agreement may be necessary. And then he recalls the example of the Baltic states. They were occupied by the Soviet Union after 1940, but this occupation was never legally recognized by the United States and most European countries. It stayed that way until the Baltic states regained independence. But key European governments understand that the discussions cannot be limited solely to the territorial issue. Sovereignty is also important. The fact is that Moscow is demanding significant restrictions on Kyiv's freedom to choose its own course. This includes a ban on membership in NATO and possibly in the European Union, as well as restrictions on the size and capabilities of Ukrainian forces. And finally, I'll give you one more quote from the Financial Times. Ukraine obviously cannot accept any military restrictions that could harm the country's ability to defend itself. But if Kyiv is allowed to continue its efforts to join the European Union, then the issue of NATO may be taken off the agenda for a while, especially considering that the political reality is such that Ukraine's membership in NATO seems unrealistic in the near future. That's one perspective on the situation, if we look at it, let's say, from a slightly different angle. So I'll stop here. Write your thoughts and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.